Previously, I talked about the differences and the similarities in pre-processing, task data and resting state data. So if you already have a handle on processing task-based data, a lot of this may be review to you, but I still want to cover it, give you a sense of what is going on at each of the different steps. And moving into this afternoon, we're going to overview the CONN toolbox. We're going to actually create a project to do our pre-processing and denoising, and then load some data, this NYU data set, and I'll be guiding you through analyzing a single subject. It's not going to take that long. So we're going to do all the actual processing in real time. It may take 5-10 minutes tops, I would say, depending on how fast your machine is. And after we've done that, I'd like to encourage you to point out a couple settings you can change if you're so inclined, know what they do, and know why you may want to change them at some point. This CONN toolbox, well, let me explain. Part of my job is to identify toolboxes and programs which may be useful. And to do that, I need to know which ones have staying power, right? Which ones are going to hang around for a while. You may have run into this at some point. Usually, like a postdoc or a team of people, they get together, they create some new tool, they create some new toolbox, and it's popular for 6 months, a year, but then those people leave academia, and you're left holding the bag. Yeah, it happens. It happens quite a bit. So when something like the CONN toolbox or MRTrix, which has like a dedicated team behind it and it's been out for years and they keep updating it regularly, I prefer to focus on that, on those types of toolboxes. And this particular one was created at MIT by the Whitfield Gabrielli lab. Both Susan and this other, is he a professor or research scientist? Alfonso Nieto Castañón. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what his title is exactly, but they're the main developers of this toolbox, and they have some other people helping them out too. And what I like about it, besides the fact that it's been supported, it's been developed over the years, the interface is very clean. It's one of the cleanest toolbox interfaces that I've seen. It's not too flashy, but it does give you everything you need. It works through everything in a very logical, consecutive sequence. And I hope you'll see how once you get a grasp on how to analyze a single subject and also a group, how easily you can apply it to any data set. Maybe. But I hope that is how it's going to work out. Also, just because some of you were here for the FSL workshop, I need to clarify the terms because FSL is an outlier in how they define first and second level analyses. You probably can't see this, but they have a couple tabs. There's first level analysis, second level results. With FSL, a first level was analyzing a single run for a subject. Second level was analyzing the runs across a subject, and third level was group analysis. Now everybody else, including CONN toolbox, uses first level to describe analyzing everything for the single subject. And then second level is group results. Just wanted to make that clear in case there's any proactive interference in your memory. I used the psychological term, wow. It's so rewarding. Now the CONN toolbox, as I said, it's very self-contained, but they do call upon SPM functions for pre-processing, which is why you need SPM installed. So anything you do with SPM to analyze task data or anything you've done in SPM, it's going to be calling upon the same thing. So SPM realign, SPM normalize, SPM smooth, all of that it's going to use. Now, as was mentioned before, what if you have everything already processed outside of the CONN toolbox? You've already done all your pre-processing outside of it. That's totally fine because CONN will give you an option to simply import that. But if you want, you can do it either way. Same for artifact detection and removal. So there's the R toolbox. You can use that to identify which volumes are a problem. You can create that regressor and then import that regressor into the CONN toolbox. But CONN has their own way of doing that. So I would recommend, if you're starting from ground zero, just do everything with the CONN toolbox from start to finish. It simplifies things, and if you have a problem, they're more likely to be able to help you on the message boards. Okay, so basic functions. Again, you load data. You can create a new project. Something they have, which SPM does not, is a very useful time series viewer. And this is an important part of QA checking. So you can look at both anatomical. You can flip through the slices pretty easily. You can look at your entire time series for the functional data and see if any of the outliers that are being detected are actually, in fact, due to motion. Or maybe there's really nothing wrong with the data at that time point. It just seems to be more intense for whatever reason. And you may still decide to remove it, or you could just let it be. And lastly, obviously, pre-process everything and then run the correlation analyses. Now, I was talking to some people over lunch, and it does allow you to set up many different kinds of contrasts, whether you have a between groups design, whether you have pre-post, whether you have time point 1, time point 2. There's a cookbook. I'm just going to show you when we get to that point what they have in the manual, because it describes virtually every possible scenario you could come into, and it tells you how to set up the contrasts for that particular analysis. So you'll be seeing something like this. Like I said, it's very consecutive. On the very left, you'll have, on the very top contains each different processing module. So for setup, that's loading your data. That's setting up all your covariates at the first and second level, specifying your ROIs, different masks, so gray matter, white matter, any different tissue type that you're extracting from, you set it up there. And then within that, you actually set the numbers and everything. And then, so you get all that done, you move on to the next one, denoising. You have some more options on the left, you run through those, and so on. So I really like the interface. It's very clean and very well laid out. Now, while it's doing this, as it's doing pre-processing, you can see in the MATLAB window what functions it's calling upon exactly. So be aware of that. And in this viewer, again, you can look at the structural images. And notice there's a drop-down menu at the bottom, if you can see it. There's structural tools, functional tools, which allows you to check things like, has everything been normalized correctly? What does the time series look like before, after it's been pre-processed? First volume, last volume, any kind of outliers. For the preprocessing pipeline, does anybody analyze their data in FreeSurfer? Just as a matter of course. Okay. Well, if you do, at some point, you may enjoy this, but it allows you to do all the preprocessing on a surface. So if you did run everything through FreeSurfer, you have a different surface per subject. FreeSurfer parcelates the gray matter into different nodes and also has some subcortical structures as well. It can run everything on that surface. It has some advantages. With a surface, you're much less likely to have data being smeared across, say, gyri, right? So if I could have a single voxel encompass two very distinct regions, if there's, say, a fissure here. But surface removes all that, and you can also get some very nice figures from that. Although we can cheat a little bit and render everything on a surface, even if we didn't analyze it on a surface, which makes CONN useful. So before we get started, I want to go over each of these briefly, show you an animation. Again, you may have seen this during FSL, but for those who are new, just to know what we're dealing with, here are the main ones I'm going to talk about. So slice time correction, motion correction, registration, normalization, and smoothing. Let's take a look at each one of those. And remember, the whole reason we're doing pre-processing is so that we can get a cleaner time series, something that's not confounded with anything that we don't want it to be. If you've worked with fMRI data for any length of time, you're aware that it's mostly crap, right? I mean, it's very, very messy. There's no other way to describe it. That's why we need so many stinking trials to get a good estimate of what's going on. And then on top of that, people are breathing, they're moving, they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and we need to filter all that out. Anybody do photography by chance? Okay. I don't either, but you know, if somebody's moving around that messes up the image. You know, lighting matters a lot. You do a lot of post-processing. You try to get the thing to look as good as possible. We're doing the exact same thing here. So first up, slice time and correction. When we acquire these volumes, so again, I like to think of them as, you know, giant Rubik's cubes, right, composed of voxels, which are these smaller cubes. And you're analyzing you're taking a measurement every TR, every 1 second, 2 second, whatever you have, at that particular voxel. But when we acquire these things, what happens is we are acquiring slices into like 1 slice, 2 slice, 3 slice, and so on from bottom to top. Sometimes this is done in an interleaf sequence, so every other one, then you do every other one after that. But so in reality, it takes 1 TR to traverse from the first slice to the last slice. Right? So there's some time that needs to take, but slice time corrected acts as though everything was acquired at the same time. So it shifts what the signal looks like in every. Let me stop this for a second. That's stopped. Yeah, you're artificially shifting what at what time the signal happened, so that it all basically happened at the same time, right? So instead of everything happening in discrete time points, you kind of say, hey, I just want everything as though it was all acquired at the same time. Now, some arguments against this are, 1, you want to avoid interpolation whenever possible, and 2, it really doesn't seem to make that much difference for relatively short TRs. These days, and also if you're doing, say, a task experiment, you can account for those differences with a temporal derivative. Does anybody acquire using multiband? I'm curious. Okay. Are you using a GE scanner? Siemens? Okay. So multiband, it really bumps up your temporal resolution, right? Because you can acquire multiple slices simultaneously, and your TR can go from, say, 2 seconds to 1 second or less quite easily. So in those cases, slice time and correction, how much is it actually, you know, gaining? You know, we're ostensibly trying to correct. You know, if we were doing a task design, we'd want to make we act as though everything occurred at the same time, right? But slice time and correction, it introduces some interpolations, and if you're below a second, I mean, what are you really gaining? At that point, I prefer not to do it, but it's up to you. It really is. Some people strongly recommend it. Some people don't. Yeah.
The director of the physicist at the center here, he was saying another issue has to do with like if someone moves within like a TR.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
what your comments are on that? Like that's another issue for slice timing. If it happens during the TR, then you're
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So those pre-processing steps aren't orthogonal, right? And we act as though we do this module right here, slice time and correction, and then we do co-registration and motion correction. But you know, depending on how these things are correlated, you could be reintroducing some of what was supposed to be filtered out by a previous step. There's a new paper out by Martin Lindquist's group well, it's not published yet. It's a preprint. But they're showing, and it seems pretty convincing, that a lot of these pre-processing steps are not orthogonal, and that they may actually be, reintroducing some noise at different parts of the pipeline. Their recommendation is to basically do it all at once in a GLM framework. Now, how that's implemented, I'm not entirely sure, but that's their recommendation. So all the sources of variance are accounted for simultaneously.
What's the name of the group again? I know you said it's
Linquist, Lindquist. I can send it to you later. Yeah. So if it gets published, it's probably going to be pretty controversial, I'd say, because they're claiming to show that the way we do it, like step one, step two, step three, it's mixing some stuff back in there. Yeah. Yep. How was Quanjin, by the way? He's good? Yeah? All right. So motion correction, which is very important in fMRI, obviously, but even more so in resting state. Simple idea where we say, we have this image acquired at one time point, another image acquired another time point. Let's say it shifted a millimeter. It's probably more than a millimeter. But all we do is we mark that, and then during motion correction, we move that back to the reference slice, or the reference image. We do that for every volume in the time series. Let's say the first volume was our reference. We put everything back to that, and then we can not only motion correct, but also generate how much we had to move it by. And you can include this later as a regressor in your model. So you'll get plots like these. This was this, the three translations, X, Y, Z directions, and also the three rotations you can have as well. So these are typically included as regressors in the model to account for those sources of variance. An additional option, up to you, but some people like to do it, is to include the derivatives of these as well. Now, your degrees of freedom, it's limited by your effective number of time points. So number of time points accounted for temporal smoothing. And usually you have more than enough to account for things like this. So if you want to include derivatives, I recommend doing it. I don't see a huge downside to doing it. And it doesn't seem to be correlated with any of the resting state signal that you're interested in. Well, I mean, if it is, you're trying to remove anything related to motion. Now, registration, we have our anatomical images, we have functional images. Registration aligns the two as best it can, usually by using where the functional is dark and the anatomical is bright, and then takes both of those and aligns them to some template. So that's a normalization step. The voxel sizes, the image dimensions, they're all standardized so that you can compare them across studies. And in addition, these days, MNI appears to be the most popular choice, right? TileRack is on its way out, so I would strongly discourage you from using a TileRack template. But the CONN Toolbox, I don't think even allows you to do that. Oh, the last part was showing that MNI is an average of these. Okay. Now these transformations, there's a couple different things you can do, linear transformations and nonlinear. So for the linear transformations, let's say we have the template we want to normalize to. We have also the subject image. A few different things we can do here to get them to align as best we can. You can translate, which is simply moving it in one direction. You can do rotations, so around the X, Y, Z axes, any way that you want. You can do zooms where you increase the whole thing or decrease it to try to best overlay as possible. Shears, where if I took the two corners of, say, a rectangle or a square, I turn it into a parallelogram. And is there one more? No. So those are the linear transformations. You have 12 degrees of freedom total. With that, 3 of each. So they match the overall size and position, but not necessarily the shape. And during QA, we'll be reviewing how to make sure that it was a good fit. Now, nonlinear transformations, if you're curious about that, they're better at matching the internal structures, but there are also more chances for things to go wrong with the nonlinear warp. So you need to be very careful about applying that. Really check it to make sure nothing went wrong. Now, in that case, so linear transformations, all you need to know about that is anything I do on one part of the image, there's kind of like an equal and opposite reaction on the other part. So, if I do a shear, I'm torquing it this way. I also got to torque it the other way by the same amount. I rotate it this way. The whole thing has to rotate, so it tilts this way and also this way at the same time, right? With nonlinear, you don't need to preserve that relationship. So it's like squeezing a sponge, right? I can make this part get really small, and it could balloon really big over here, right? If I do a linear transformation, that would be a zoom, and everything would have to be smaller or bigger. Yeah. It's up to you. More people are recommending nonlinear transformations because, as we'll see during the QA checks, the most important things to look at are the internal structures, right? So things like ventricles, things like the gyri and the involutions into the cortex. Because what they used to do, like the bare minimum, would be to match the total outlines of the brains, right? But that really doesn't tell you a lot about what's happening inside the brain. So you could get these huge discrepancies between the gray and white matter boundaries, for example. And nonlinear is a little bit better at that. But again, more ways for things to go seriously wrong. Smoothing, I want to say a few words about. Okay, so not too complicated. At each voxel, we take the average of that and all its neighbors. And how many neighbors, that's determined by your smoothing kernel. So if I have a really big smoothing kernel, I average across a lot of neighbors. Small smoothing kernel, not as many. With our resting state analysis, the default preprocessing pipeline is going to do smoothing as just a normal processing step. But when it does the analyses, it's actually going to take the time series from the unsmoothed data. Why would we do that? Because if I'm taking a seed region of however many voxels, tens, maybe 100 or so, you're already averaging across all those voxels. Furthermore, if you're going to be doing smoothing, you're at risk for smoothing across different tissue types. It's going to do its best to separate those and only smooth within one of the masks, but this is kind of a guarantee against doing that. You may get some partial voluming effects. A voxel may include, 2 or more tissue types, but analyzing from the unsmoothed data is, I'll say that it's recommended in the CONN toolbox. That's what it's going to do. So you'll have smoothed images, but be aware that your analysis may not necessarily use the smoothed data. Okay, you can choose to do that later if you want. Yeah. Yeah, whatever the step was before the smooth. And from what I recall, smooth is the last preprocessing step done, so you should be okay. Yeah. Okay, lastly, temporal filtering, which is kind of a controversial topic. But if I have a time series, I can represent this as a series of frequencies, say sine waves. All temporal filtering does is it determines a threshold below or above which I'm not going to allow any frequencies to pass. So we could delete, say, sine 1, and cosine 3 if I had a bandpass filter. And then I would take the remaining frequencies that I decompose this into, reconstruct it without those removed frequencies to get a bandpass filter data set. Right? That's all it's doing. If you remember that design matrix I showed you, right, we had a lot of regressors showing which frequencies were being regressed out of the data. And there were some very slow ones, and there were some very high frequency ones. Yeah, it's not covering all of them. It's not continuous, but it does its best to remove the representative ones. Yeah.
So that kind of leads into my question. Do they tend to cluster together in terms of their frequencies, or they're all different in terms of the physiological noise?
Do what tend to cluster together?
The frequencies, like the noise frequencies of your.
Oh. It's a good question. I wouldn't say they necessarily cluster together, but the problem ones are found within a certain range, right? So things like slow scanner drift, or would be another one. Yeah, that'd be one of them. So it's sometimes hard to determine what exact frequency it is, especially like the physiological ones if you don't directly measure them. But based on the data that's out there, these seem to be the best cutoffs to use, while still preserving the signal that you're interested in. Okay. So that all said, let's actually start to use some data. And we're going to start this with only looking at a single subject and then build from there. Does anybody not have the single subject downloaded? Okay. Then we're all good. Make sure you know where it is, because it may be in a slightly different location on my computer than your computer. Let's see here. So I'm going to go to my desktop, and I have this within single subject CONN. It's not absolutely necessary that you navigate to that directory from MATLAB, but as you'll see, when I'm in a certain directory, then when I open up Windows from the CONN Toolbox, it's going to be relative to that. It'll be easier just to select the data that I need. So from here, we're going to select New. Okay. I guess go to Project. Project New blank. Okay, it didn't like clicking on New for some reason. And it's going to ask you for a project name. For this one, you could just call it single subject. Doesn't matter, just something that's informative. Can everybody read the text okay? I can't change my font, unfortunately. But as long as we can still follow along. So save that out. It's going to be saved as a .conn format. And then here again is what I was talking about, where you have these different modules up here set up to noising, analysis, and results. And then on the side, everything within that particular module. So the basic information about it, loading your structural functional images, and then we can do the preprocessing. In this case, we only have one subject. We only have one session. And if you hover over any of these fields, you'll get a helpful pop-up bar. Right? So it's a good way to guide you through all this. The repetition time in seconds, you'll need to know that from your scan sheets. As far as I can tell, it's not going to automatically read it from the header for you, so you need to make sure that you have it. but in this case it actually is 2 seconds. Acquisition type, continuous versus sparse. Continuous is virtually what you'll always be doing. I've seen sparse used in certain language studies, for example. Oh, you do? Do you do sparse analysis? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Vince Gracco did this where the subject would have to make some kind of verbal response or something, and they didn't want. Right. Yeah. Right. So basically, you're not hearing the noise, so it's not acquiring volumes, and then there's like a brief period where nothing is happening. So, what's that?
I don't see choices. Mine just says continue.
Oh, if you click on it, yeah,
Oh, click on it.
yeah.
Got it.
But you'll probably just be using continuous for most of these. Okay, so that's basic information. Later on, as we have more subjects, obviously you just fill in the fields as necessary, which we'll see later today. Now, if you click on structural, okay, this actually isn't your subject. This is some reference image. So notice that, you know, in MATLAB, when I navigated to that directory, I'm seeing everything that's listed in that directory. So that's why I changed it there beforehand. So within that, this is my directory browser. I'm going to double click on a NAT. You should only see MP-Rage anonymized and MP-Rage skull stripped. Right. I already analyzed this, so I'm just going to overwrite it. You don't see it? Oh, you do? Oh, then maybe I gave you the analyzed stuff. But in any case, what came raw from the scanner was MP-Rage anonymized and MP-Rage skull stripped. Select MP-Rage anonymized. The only difference is, you know, the MP-Rage skull stripped was actually skull stripped. If you double click on that and you click OK, yeah, it's pretty cool. This is the basic CONN viewer. You can go through all the different slices. Notice that it's anonymized, so the teeth, everything has been, the jawline has been removed. Yeah.
So that's how they make it.
Yeah, well, I'll show you. If you click on the circle right here above the up and down arrows, you can switch the orthogonal view. So axial to coronal to sagittal. And this is why it's anonymized. There's a program, PyDface, which, yeah, they recommend using before you upload any data publicly. Or this could just be a guy who is losing a part of his face. Who knows? Okay, are we all caught up?
It's going to take a minute. I only unzipped the anatomical.
Oh, I see. Are you okay if we move on?
Yeah.
All right. So, play around with that. Just make sure nothing looks like there's an artifact, aside from the missing face, nothing looks like an artifact. If you saw severe motion during the anatomical scan, it should be obvious here as like a ringing artifact. But we don't see that here. A lot of options. I'm not going to cover all of these, but something you may be interested in is slice viewer with MNI boundaries. Now, this has not been. Oh, if you click on structural tools, yeah. Yep. In yellow is the MNI outlines. Now, this is fine because we haven't done any normalization, any preprocessing to this data yet. So that's what you should expect. If for some reason this data already had been analyzed somehow, this is a way to check for that, but obviously it hasn't been. These are all options I recommend playing with at some point. We're not going to go through all of them, but you can change the reference points if you want. If you're going through different slices, you can view this in different planes if you check all these different check boxes. Again, what's going to be useful for you, can't really tell, but you do have quite a bit of options to look at this. But anyway, that's one of the basic checks that I do. Aside from that, slice viewer may be interesting if you want to see each individual slice. And later on, when we load all of the subjects from a data set, it's like all 25, you can look at each slice in a montage at the same time. So after you've done all your normalization, that's useful just to check quickly, has everything actually worked? Next thing after that, obviously, is now loading the functional images. This, if you probably can't see it, it says ... Yeah, that's Unix convention to mean one directory up. So I'm in the anatomical directory right now. I want to get to the functional directory. So I could either click on a NAT to get this directory browser, or just double click on the two dots to get up one directory. Once I'm there, I'm going to double click on the func directory. Yeah. And the raw data is lfo.nii.
Sorry, ULFO?
Just LFO. Yeah. I don't know why they labeled it that, but that was the raw data. You okay, Parker?
My computer just can't handle it.
You what?
My computer can't handle it.
Oh, no.
It's like lagged out.
Anybody else having that problem? Okay. Yeah. If as we're going along, it seems to really fall behind, I would just partner up with, yeah. So double click on that. That gets us, oh, LFO. Yeah. And this viewer shows you on the left the very first volume in that time series and the very last volume in that time series. So at a glance, if there was a huge motion change across the entire time series, it would be very obvious here.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, on the left is the first volume in the time series, and on the right is the last image in the time series. So if I saw a huge discrepancy between the two, it's actually good they look the same right here. But if they moved a ton, they would look very different. If I click randomly on any part in that brain, it's going to load this time series viewer. Okay, so again, this hasn't been filtered. It's the raw data. But this is what the time series looks like from time point 1 to the final time point.
Oh, it identifies the region.
Yeah. Well, it tries. I wouldn't pay too much attention to that yet. It might be pretty close, but it hasn't been normalized yet. That's pretty good. But
Do we know what plane these data were collected in? Because that's a good job of presenting in 3D.
when you say 3D, did you?
Because I'm looking at sagittal.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure how they're required, to be honest. But again, as with the anatomical, you can go through the slices, you can look at the different views, anything you want. And with time series data, here's an important QA check that I recommend people do. So I clicked on functional tools to get this help menu. I really wish I could bump up the font, but unfortunately I can't. Let's see, where is it? Display single slice for all time points. Click on that. This is a check I do with task data 2. Right? So it plays a movie, and it goes through every volume. You can click on the arrow just to go through one volume sequentially. Looks like there is a little bit of motion. if you want to go through it consecutively, just click on play. What else can I say about this? That's pretty much it. That's just a check I like to do to see what, if any, motion artifacts are there and what they look like. So I exited out of that, go back to functional tools, and then you can display the slice viewer with M&I boundaries, if you so wish. Take a quick look, make sure it's not normalized yet. Later on, we are going to be checking this after it does the normalization. And notice in particular, these ventricles, how they're outlined in the template. We're going to check those against the normalized data. So exit out of that. Last thing I'll show you here. If you're really used to SPM and you prefer to look at your data in SPM, the CONN Toolbox is very tightly connected with the SPM program. So if you have SPM installed, which you should for CONN to work, and you click on Display Functional Anatomical Co-Registration, it's going to open up the SPM graphical user interface. Now we haven't done any co-registration yet, so they're going to look very off, yeah, and that's fine. But this is something we're going to look at after we do the basic pre-processing. So after it does registration, check to make sure you can either use the CONN viewer or the SPM viewer. Any questions about those basic views of the data?
So is it also saving, like, let's say I did my pre-processing in CONN, it's also saving all those versions, so if I want to later
Yeah.
do something outside of CONN, I've got
Yeah, I'll show you. Yeah.
smooth normalized.
Yeah, everything is going to be saved, which is why the pre-processed NYU data set, which I have on Drive, is so gigantic. If you want, I have it on an external hard drive, and it might be a little bit quicker. I can pass it around later on. Okay, so once these two things have been loaded, you're happy with it. Nothing looks too out of line. There won't be anything on the face of it where I'd say this subject has a problem. Toss it. Then click on pre-processing. Okay, so it's not intuitive when you would do the pre-processing, but all we've done is load the structural, load the functional. Everything else below that, like the ROIs, the covariates, we're going to get to later. Okay, we just loaded everything and we want to pre-process it. Unlike SPM, it just gives you like a pre-packaged start to finish pre-processing pipeline. Now you have a few options here. So the default pre-processing pipeline is what you're going to want to do in virtually all cases, right? Because it'll do everything from start to finish. If you want to do any of these individual steps, right? So let's say I just want to do the realignment and unwarp for whatever reason. You can just do that. Really, every possible processing step you could do in SPM, you can also pick and choose right here. Yeah.
So this is like the situation where you might have pre-processed an SPM first.
Exactly. Yeah. So in that case, I would, in the structural and functional, I would just load the data that's already been pre-processed, and you should be able to skip over this. Yeah. As long as I'd still look in the functional tools, like has it been, what do the boundaries look like? Yeah.
Does this do like the B0 warping at all? Like,
I think it has an option to do that. I don't know. I don't think that's default. It's a good question. I haven't checked that, but I do know that it is one of the. Oh, yeah, right here. So when field maps are available, that's the second option there. Yeah. And again, if you've done any sort of surface-based processing in FreeSurfer, you have options for doing that as well. I think, yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. So click on Default Preprocessing Pipeline, click OK. And you can change what the order is. So if I wanted to move up, move down any of these, you could do so if you're so inclined. I don't see any reason to change it. I'd just like to leave it alone. Let's see here. So processing all subjects, processing all sessions. We're doing a single subject, so that doesn't really matter right now. But if you were doing, let's say you had gathered 20 subjects at one point, and you gathered some more later, you still wanted them in the same spm.mat file, but you only wanted to pre-process the people who had not been pre-processed yet. Then you could uncheck that and only select the ones that hadn't been pre-processed. Does that make sense? I don't have an example data set to use for that, but you could do that. Yeah. And other option, we're not going to cover this because I don't have access to a cluster, but you just ignore that for now. What's that?
So pre-process all subjects, that means if we have a lot of subjects, we can do.
Yeah, this will just loop over all of them.
And do we need to input all the subjects at the beginning?
Yeah, I'll show you how to do that when we import the entire data set.
Can you see the parameters that are underlying defaults? Like, how exact, like
Yeah.
SPM, you have all these options to select from.
Yeah.
Yeah. To see what is being done.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I haven't changed them before. So what you could do is you could analyze it outside in SPM.
I think in here you can't even see what they've selected as.
I haven't seen an option to do that. Yeah. If I were to go into the scripting part heavily, what you could do, you load the default preprocessing pipeline. You save out the entire thing as a mat file. Like you can save out the project as a mat file, and then go into that, tweak the parameters you want, reload it, and then run it. I will cover like a very simple example of that in the scripting session, but I'm not going to cover the whole thing. I'm going to close this door. Yes, please. Okay. So these are all good questions. And they can be modified. They've said, these give us the best results. Here's what we know works. Yeah. You have control later over things like, for example, like the bandpass that's applied. But they're particular about what options you have direct control over here. Okay. Should we do it? Yeah? Okay, quick start. And lastly, this was acquired on a Siemens, so select interleaved for slice order.
Interleave Siemens.
Yeah. Okay. It's also going to ask you about which. See if I'm remembering this correctly. Yeah. So it's going to ask you, up to what percentile of, what is it again? I think this has to do with, what volumes for which motion and also which global signal values are you going to remove, right? So if you want to do this manually, and you said, I only want to keep volumes that have global signal that is less than 5 z-scores away from the mean, right? and I only want to keep volumes that have a motion millimeter threshold of 0.9 or less. You'd only keep those. Now use diff motion. These are going to be those derivatives. Right? And then they'll also give you this option for a composite motion measure, which is that frame-wise displacement measurement I was talking about. So they're going to be adding a lot of regressors to your model. This is just the way the CONN toolbox rolls. They prefer to add a lot of regressors to account for any confounds. And because we usually have so many time points in resting state data, we can get away with it in most cases. Assuming you're not, say, scrubbing more than, say, 15, 20% of your volumes. Yeah.
And this subject motion threshold, like the 0.9, is pretty typical because the one you showed us before was like 0.2.
Yeah, AFNI is much more severe for whatever reason. It is a huge difference. I think AFNI, personally, I think that's way too stringent, because whenever I tried to analyze my resting state through that pipeline, even if subjects were pretty good, I would lose a lot of volumes, right?
This is the same group, the Woodfield lab also developed the art detection.
It also depends to some extent on your voxel size that you're acquiring, right? So if I had 3 by 3 by 3 voxels, you're probably less likely to run into major problems with, moving where one voxel is being measured from one, say, tissue type to another, if the voxels are relatively large, than if they're pretty small, right? But 0.9 for most cases, I would say, is fine. Okay, if you hit OK, oh, there's one more thing. God, I keep forgetting about these. These defaults, I'm not going to change them. The tissue probability maps is going to extract gray matter, white matter, CSF. It's going to make those different tissue classes. And then we're normalizing this to a structural image. It's this MNI template, which comes with SPM, I believe. It's probably the same MNI template. That's going to be 1 by 1 millimeters. And then the functionals are going to be resampled to 2 by 2 by 2 millimeters resolution, which is pretty common. And lastly, smoothing kernel. Up to you. I think 8 is a little generous in most cases. Like I said, you have the option of using the smooth or the unsmooth data. So up to you. I'm going to change this to 5. You can leave it at whatever you want. We're probably going to get roughly the same thing.